Hi there, I'm Mike Graves, and I'll be reading from my book, All Hallows Shadows. All Hallows Shadows takes place in October 1937, although what I'm going to begin with is a flashback scene that starts sometime earlier. So we're going back to 1937, October. First chapter is Grandma Was Special. Even before she told me her story about seeing the ghost of her great uncle, I knew my grandma was special. She possessed a quiet patience, a dignity sometimes lacking in others. When a crisis arose, when others flitted and flew and squandered time and energy on futile gestures, Grandma waited and observed. She bided her time, thoughtful and calm. She peered into corners and gazed into shadows. Grandma noticed things that other people missed. And now Grandma speaks. It was cold that night, cold and clear and still. An early frost hung in the air, and I tucked the blanket up under my chin. Full moon shining. What was it Papa said? A dying grass moon, he called it. That was it. A dying grass moon. That full October moon. Trees going bare, long shadows, no stars. Some claimed that spirits stirred on such a night. An owl hooted, a twig snapped. I started, my little girl imagination turned into ghosts and goblins and such. A body felt mighty small beneath that prairie sky. Were you scared, Grandma? Oh, no, not really. Not with Papa on one side and Mama on the other. I was safe. Our mare snorted and snuffed and leaned into the harness, blowing clouds of mist. The buggy creaked and rattled. I curled beneath the blanket and snuggled close to Mama. She slept on the seat and her jowls jiggled as we passed over the rutted road. Papa dozed on my other side, reins loose over one hand. He'd snuck out behind the barn to tip a jug between dances, him and his pals, thinking the ladies would be none the wiser. And the ladies pretended they didn't notice. Corn liquor had lifted his spirits and claimed his body. He fought sleep. His head bobbed and dropped, down, down, then snapped up like a fish hooked on a line. He popped open his eyes, twisted his neck, puffed his cheeks, and blew a breath. He gazed into the darkness, got his bearings, and did it all over again. His eyelids drooped, his head bobbed, his chin dropped. I tried not to giggle. I wondered why he just didn't go to sleep. That mare knew the way home as well as Papa did, and she didn't need any prodding to get there neither. Grandma's chuckle spilled over her pink gums and her tongue flicked over her lips. Her teary eyes squinted behind the tiny wire-framed glasses that rested on her nose. Light from a dim bulb haloed the white bun atop her head. She looked angelic. What about the ghost, Grandma? When did you see the ghost? Well, as we drew near our place, the road rose up over a narrow bridge that passed over a creek. That was our guidepost, our signal that home was just ahead, that bridge. The mare knew it too, and she leaned forward and stepped a bit faster. That's when I saw him, just out of the shadows, standing right there on that bridge, in the light of the moon. I saw a tall man, a thin man, what we call gaunt. He wore long gray whiskers and had a black top hat. Under a dark coat, he wore a red checkered vest with a gold chain draped across it. Wow, a real ghost now? Were you scared? Grandma smiled and gathered me in with fleshy arms and dimpled elbows and lay my head against her breast. She patted my head and whispered, No, child, no, I wasn't afraid, not in the least. I grew rather calm. I saw no reason to be afraid, no reason at all. The man smiled at me and raised a hand and waved and nodded as we rolled by. And then he faded back into the shadows. And you didn't even know who it was? Not then, I didn't know. The next morning at breakfast, I told about what I'd seen. When I described the man, my folks stopped chewing their food. They put down their forks and listened. And when I told about the red checkered vest and gold chain, Mama gave Papa a look. Neither one spoke. I said, "What? What is it?" And Mama took my hand and said, "That was the spirit of your great Uncle Horace, dear. That's just what he looked like, tall and gaunt with a long beard." He was so proud of that watch and chain, a wedding gift from his bride. He bought a red vest to better show it off and never went anywhere without it. I asked Mama when he had died, and she said, "Before you were born." He died not long after his wife passed over. She went with rheumatic fever, and her death left him heartbroken. He took to drinking. Some say his horse threw him that night. Others say he simply fell out of the saddle after an evening spent with John Barleycorn. Either way, he died right there, right at that bridge. They found his body in the creek. A chill fell over me. Wow. So you really did see a ghost, huh, Grandma? You really did? Yes, I did. My mother said I had a gift, what with being born on Easter Sunday and all, but I don't know. Seeing a ghost never seemed all that unusual to me. It seemed perfectly normal. I never have believed that we're alone in this life. I figure that anyone who's willing to slow down a bit, to tread easy, to look into the shadows, those folks will discover magic, magic that busy folks might miss. What kind of magic, Grandma? Grandma chuckled. You just wait, little one. Just wait and watch. Slow down. Go easy. You'll see. She hugged me and I wanted to speak, but I was interrupted by a bell, a harsh clashing sound over and over. What's that sound, Grandma? That ringing? What's that noise? She smiled and opened her arms and released me. She fell away, grew faint, and faded into the shadows. The clanging grew louder and repeated, again and again, jangles that wouldn't stop, wouldn't stop. Grandma, where are you? Don't leave, come back. But she was gone. I could no longer see her. That's the first few pages of All Hallows Shadows. I'd like to say a bit more about the book, and then we'll go back and we'll read a little bit more. My adventure with Pete Stone, the detective in 1937 Wichita, began, 7 or 8 years ago when I recalled some words my grandfather said to my father. They were his last words to my father. He said, "Tell the boys not to forget me." And I got to thinking about that. It was a half century later. I got to thinking about those words, "Tell the boys not to forget me." And I realized I hadn't forgotten my grandfather, but I never knew my grandfather like I had hoped I would. It was simply a matter of time and geography. We lived in another part of the country. We'd come back and visit maybe once a year, but they were usually short visits before my dad had to get back to work. So I never really grew up with my grandfather, never really knew him. And I thought, well, I'll just make up a story. He was not a detective. He was not, but he did live. He was not a detective, but he did live in 1937 Wichita. That was his era. And I thought, I'll write about the detective, but I'll make sure that the backstory, the things that the sidewalks that he walked, the movies that he saw, the newspapers that he read, I'll make those as accurate as I can, because I wanted to have an idea of what he lived through, what it was like back during that time for him and for others. So I began my search at the Wichita Public Library. I've always turned to libraries when I need to find information, and I did. And I found some wonderful people there who were willing to help me, and I've always appreciated that. And they got me hooked up, so I was reading microfilm copies of the 1937 newspaper, the Wichita Eagle, gave me a copy of a wonderful map of 1940 Wichita, which has become very valuable to me. I use that all the time when I plot Pete Stone's travels throughout the city. And so I began getting a feel for the time and the place. And the place was in Wichita, as I say. I needed a place for Pete to live. So I went to my birth certificate and found a place near 11th and Llewellyn in Wichita. And I used that as his address. I didn't want to call Pete Graves. So I thought, well, Graves, gravestone, stone. And that's how Pete Stone came to be. My grandfather lived about the same time as one of my favorite authors, Dashiell Hammett, who wrote, among other things, The Maltese Falcon with Sam Spade. And so I decided out of a tribute to Dashiell Hammett, I would use his birth date and date of death for my grandfather. Similar, but not exactly to what my grandfather's was. I began thinking about things that my grandfather did like. He had a wonderful collection of clocks in his home. I remember that. And he was very proud of the fact we'd love to be in his home at noon, because at noon they would all chime and they would chime at the same time. And we thought that was pretty terrific. I do mention throughout the book, my grandfather Pete, as well as most people back then, did smoke a lot of cigarettes. They'd have a drink of bourbon when they could get one. So my characters do that also. My grandfather, this was family lore. I never heard this from his words, but he and a partner shared a dairy delivery business. And when the Depression hit, they realized that the business, although it was doing okay, wasn't going to support two families. So they flipped a coin. They tossed a coin. My grandfather lost, and he went on to do something else and lost the business. No hard feelings. That's just the way it was. I never write too much about politics. I am working on a manuscript that will touch on some political aspects. Politics back then was generally considered something personal and private, so I didn't write a lot. I felt that my grandfather was apolitical, but I do know he championed the underdog, as did my dad. I put in, because I love baseball so much, I include some baseball references, again, trying to remain historically accurate as to what was going on in the city at that time. And then I went to other places to do research. There's a wonderful online site called wichitaphotos.org. And it's just terrific, because I can go on and I can see literally hundreds of pictures from the Civil War era, just past the Civil War, to the 2000s. And so I can get some pretty good pictures and look at those while I'm sitting at my computer. As an example, if I could share this with you, this is from a manuscript that I'm working on now. And I wrote, this is not published. I drove to my office downtown. I wanted to get Pete to his office. As a sentence, it says what it does, but it's pretty boring. I drove to my office downtown. So I went to wichitaphotos.org and looked at some pictures of the buildings downtown and changed that one sentence to read this. I crossed the river and drove east into downtown. At Douglas and Main, two clerks in shirt sleeves and bow ties arranged a display of menswear in the window of Hinkle's dry goods store. At the northeast corner of Market and Douglas, customers milled on the sidewalk outside the entrance to the Fourth National Bank. I glanced at my watch. The bank would open soon. I thought of Percival Gilman, the bank's cashier, and Agnes's husband, working inside the imposing structure, striving to gain the trust and confidence of his customers, ever vigilant of his image in the community. A quote from Jacob Marley's Ghost popped into my head. I wear the chain I forged in life. So I was able to get a paragraph to replace a sentence, maybe give a little more detail on the backstory, and all I had to do was click a button. So I'm very grateful for, especially in this time of COVID, of being able to still do research. My wife and I, Monica and I, visited museums, college campus. We visited a lot of the areas in Wichita where Pete might hang out. We had lunch at a wonderful little restaurant on Seneca that became Tom's Place, which is Pete's hangout. So that's a little bit about how the story came about. I'll turn back to the book now and read a few more pages. We've just had a dream sequence, of course, and so now we're going to pick up right where we left off. Grandma, where are you? Don't leave, come back. But she was gone, and I could no longer see her. My eyes opened and I lay still. The ringing continued. From where? I grabbed the alarm clock on the nightstand, but it was silent. The ringing came from a distance. I tossed back the blanket and threw my legs over the side of the bed. My feet got tangled in the sheets, and I tripped and cracked my shin on the nightstand. I cursed the pain and hobbled to the kitchen. The telephone sat on the table alongside an ashtray and a pack of Chesterfields. I reached for the telephone with one hand and the cigarettes with the other. Yes, hello, I said into the receiver. I shook a cigarette from the pack and a masculine voice came over the line. Good morning, is this Mr. Stone? Am I speaking to Mr. Pete Stone? My reply was interrupted by another sound of bells tinkling in tune along with gongs and chimes, in chorus with cuckoos and chirps. Unlike the harsh clangs of the telephone, however, these lullabies greeted me each morning and eased me to sleep each night. My collection of clocks heralded the hours: the Black Forest cuckoo clock, the Seth Thomas grandfather clock, the recently acquired Austrian Zappler animated clock, and over a dozen others scattered throughout the house. The owner of the voice on the other end of the line heard the chimes too, and he was wise enough to hold his tongue until they ceased. I used the respite to cradle the phone on my shoulder and hold a match to a cigarette. Each clock sounded 9 times in unison. I prided myself on their accuracy. When they ceased their recital, the voice spoke again. It sounded impatient. Well, finally, please tell me, have I reached Mr. Pete Stone? Yes, you have, and a good morning to you, sir. I saw no reason to be unpleasant. The day had just begun. It still held promise, and I still had hope. My sunny tone must have caught the speaker off guard. There was a pause. Then he continued. Mr. Stone, my name is Dr. Fallon, Dr. Wilfred Fallon, and I'm a professor of English at Wichita University. I'm calling you because you have been recommended to me. That is, someone I trust suggested I give you a call. He cleared his throat and continued. Please forgive me for ringing you at home, Mr. Stone, but I tried your office and your secretary said you hadn't arrived yet. It is now 9 o'clock in the morning. May I ask what time you usually begin your day? You may ask, I said, but my answer is none of your business. I rethought my earlier decision to remain pleasant. Of course, you're correct. Forgive me, please. Your personal schedule is none of my business. Maybe I should start again. I'm afraid I've been under a bit of a strain lately, and I haven't been myself. It's been some time since I've been so baffled by circumstances and so unsure about how to proceed. That's why I called. As I mentioned, you come recommended to me by someone I admire and respect. I'm calling to inquire into the particulars of engaging your services. I mulled over the caller's priggish vocabulary. Most of my clients just hired me. No one in memory had ever inquired into the particulars of engaging my services. What's this about, Professor Fallon? I'm not sure how to begin. Are you familiar with the murder of a recent university graduate? It's been in the papers. I assured Fallon that I had read about the crime. I read the papers, I said. According to the reports, a young woman was stabbed and a suspect was caught soon after the body was discovered. The case hasn't gone to trial, but the police are confident they have the guilty party in custody. It appears to be open and shut. Yes, that's right, the professor said. That was the report. At least that's the report that was issued to the public. However, I have doubts about the case being open and shut, as you succinctly put it. I think the police may have arrested the wrong man. I believe that the suspect the police have in custody is innocent. I'd like to hire you to investigate the matter on your own, to conduct a more thorough examination. As you say, the police are confident their suspect is guilty. I do not share their confidence, not at all. I'd like to hire you to find the real murderer. I glanced at the empty coffee pot on the stove. On a normal day, I consumed at least 3 cups of hot black joe before speaking to a soul, let alone a faceless voice over the telephone. Dr. Fallon, this is a police matter. You should be talking to them. If you have proof or information regarding the suspect's innocence, you should go to the police immediately. No, please understand, I do not have proof and I cannot go to the police. I do have doubts, serious doubts, and I'd like to discuss them with you. Even so, even with no proof, if you know nothing about the case that the police don't know, or if you do know something, you should go to them. I waited for a reply. Mr. Stone, I cannot go to the police for reasons I do not wish to divulge over the phone. If we met together, our discussion might prove more enlightening and fruitful. Would you be willing to meet with me? I questioned in my mind if Fallon knew something about the murder that had escaped the police's attention. It seemed doubtful. The newspaper reports suggested the police had arrested the murderer. To tell you the truth, Professor, I'd planned on taking a few days off this week. Fallon was not put off by my comment. May I suggest this, he said. Give me an hour here in my office. 1 hour. I will pay you for your time and trouble whether you choose to assist me or not. Would that be agreeable? He was determined and anxious. Why was he reluctant to talk to the police? His request to meet him seemed reasonable, and I had to admit that he had piqued my curiosity. Okay, Professor, I said, I suppose an hour together couldn't hurt. Excellent. How about this morning? Before lunch, say 11:30? I assured him that would be fine, and he told me where to find him on campus. We said our goodbyes and rang off. I went to the stove and started a pot of coffee and showered and dressed while it brewed. After I finished knotting my tie, I poured a cup of coffee and dialed my secretary, Agnes, at my office. I took my first sip of the hot liquid just as she answered the ring with Pete Stone Investigations. Good morning, my sweet Dulcinea. This is your Don Quixote calling, your knight errant, incurable romantic, tilter at windmills and righter of wrongs. Well, the day is young, Agnes said, but you sound like you're already into the sauce. Are you starting early or have you been nursing your habit all night long? Wrong on both counts, sister, and I'm offended at your insinuations. As a matter of fact, all I'm nursing is coffee, straight and black. I'm as sober as a schoolmarm, and I'm perpendicular to the world. Thank you very much. It's early in the ball game, but I'm batting 2 for 2. First you're Don Quixote, now you're Babe Ruth. If either one of you hear from Pete Stone, you might ask him to give me a call. I'd like to hear how things went last night. Pete Stone is alive and well, kiddo. Thanks for asking. The hooligans are in the Hooskow, viewing the world from behind cell bars. Thanks to yours truly, the streets of our peerless Princess of the Plains are safer this day than they were the day before. Agnes was referring to my most recent case. I had spent the previous evening and several of the wee hours that morning on a stakeout involving a break-in and stolen goods. 2 recent graduates of the Kansas State Penitentiary at Lansing had celebrated their release by boosting a truck from a warehouse near 2nd and Wabash. I had done some work for the owner of the warehouse in the past with satisfactory results. Although I suspected not every item in his inventory would pass muster under the eyes of the law, I was a private investigator, not a judge. When he told me that the truck in question carried a load of crates marked Carnation Milk, and he offered a nod and a wink, so it wasn't really milk in the crates. It was no skin off my nose. Like I mentioned, who was I to judge? When I worked for him earlier, we had both been pleased with the outcome, so I didn't ask unnecessary questions. I accepted the job. The thieves left a trail that 3 blind mice could follow. I tracked them to a neighborhood near Lewis and Laura that had an auto repair shop on the corner and a welding shop next door. Across the street was a brief row of frame houses, 2 white and 1 gray. The stolen truck was parked in the driveway of the gray house. A tall sycamore tree with leaves gone yellow stood sentinel in front. What the two culprits lacked in smarts, they made up for in enthusiasm. I peeked through a window and caught them throwing a party for themselves and a half dozen scantily clad ladies of the night. No other males were in sight. I didn't fault their ambition. Maybe the ladies had a group rate. A portable Victrola phonograph rested on a table in one corner of the living room and played the mellow notes of Bing Crosby's Just One More Chance. The tune seemed prophetic. Maybe that's what the men were looking for. Just one more chance. Several bottles of liquor were arrayed on the sideboard, no doubt liberated from the crates marked as milk. The two men took turns dancing with the women. Everyone held a drink. I almost hated to break up the party. A couple of horny, drunk ex-cons blowing off a little steam. If I went in, there'd be screaming and shouting and violence, and who knew who'd get hurt. There might even be gunplay. None of that sounded good, so I decided to be patient, to bide my time and let the celebration wind down on its own. I returned to my roadster, parked on the street a couple of doors down, and waited and watched. The scent of new-mown grass wafted in the air. The scent and the season turned my thoughts to baseball. I mulled over the upcoming World Series and wondered if the Yankees would take it again this year, or if the Giants might figure out a way to topple them. The Yankees had Lefty Gomez on the mound, but the Giants countered with Carl Hubble, neither one a slouch. Still, the smart money was on the Yankees. The night wore on, and I listened to noises in the dark. A dog barked, a cat meowed, a screen door slammed. My thoughts drifted from baseball to women, from loves to losses, and finally to one woman. A woman who was not yet a love and not yet a loss. A woman who would be easy to love if she would let me. So far, she hadn't. She had been betrayed by a man she trusted and had grown cautious, maybe too cautious. We were attracted to each other, but she shied from my advances, and I had backed off. At first, I was hurt by her rebuffs, but I came to understand. I, too, had known betrayal. I had once fallen for an angel who turned out to be a succubus in disguise. I fell for her charms like the clown who slips on a banana peel. She pretended to love me when all she truly loved was money, and she proved she was willing to do anything to get it. When I discovered her deceit, our relationship ended. Badly. From that moment on, I promised to myself I would be more careful and more slow. Part of me promised anyway. Not all of me did. Cautiousness had its place, but it seldom led to romance, and right then my romantic prospects looked darker than the midnight sky. My watch ticked away the minutes, and the accumulation of cigarette butts on the street outside my roadster grew larger. I smoked and waited. Much of my work involved waiting. The party finally quieted down, the music stopped, and the lights in the gray house dimmed. The door opened, and several of the women staggered onto the porch and disappeared into the night. A couple of women remained in the house. An owl hooted. I waited a while longer, then I opened the car door and eased out onto the street. I stretched my stiff legs back and strolled to the phone booth on the corner. I placed 2 calls. The first, an anonymous tip to the police. The second, to the owner of the stolen goods. By the time the police arrived, the thieves were passed out cold. They came awake with only a vague sense of where they were and what they'd done. The men in blue subdued them with little trouble and no violence. The 2 remaining women were questioned briefly and released back into the shadows. The warehouse owner arrived in a sedan with another guy in the passenger seat. He explained to the police that the milk on the truck was to be delivered to a hospital in Topeka later that morning. The cops took the owner's statement while the other guy climbed into the truck and rolled away. A few minutes later, the warehouse owner got back in his car. He gave me the high sign as he drove by. I gave him a nod and drove home under a gray sky going pink. My head hit the pillow just as the sun peeked over the horizon. All is well, I said to Agnes. The culprits have been apprehended and are in police custody. The case is closed. Good for you, Agnes said. And no shots were fired. Always a good thing, she said. Always a good thing, I said. A call came in this morning, Agnes said, from a professor at the university. I know, he just called me. He's the reason I'm up at this unkind hour. Oh, Pete, I'm sorry. I didn't give him your home number. I know you didn't, sweetheart. Don't worry about it. I got a couple of hours of shut eye. A good night's sleep is overrated. I'll be fine as soon as I've had another cup of plasma. Then I'm off to see the professor. We chatted a bit longer about this, that, and the other thing and rang off. I drank more coffee and smoked another cigarette for breakfast, tidied up the kitchen, and headed out the door, bound for the university. I closed the door at my place just as the chimes and gongs began their 11 o'clock serenade. That's the first chapter of All Hallows Shadows. I'm going to stop here now. I thank you all for being here, and I am going to end the recording, but I'll be live to answer any questions and have a discussion. Thanks a lot.